Hello, I'm Jochen Eisentraut, and welcome to this Talk and Ideas interview. Today I'll be talking to John Agnew, who is Distinguished Professor of Geography at UCLA. And we're going to be discussing the idea of sovereignty, particularly in relation to Brexit. Hello, Professor Agnew.
Hello, Joachim. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Good.
Right, I'd like to kick off with the question really that arises from a paper of yours that I read called Taking Back Control, which came out in 2019, which interrogates and critiques the idea of clear sovereignty within well-defined borders of a national state. So I'd like to ask you, in what ways is sovereignty not enacted in this way, in your view?
Yeah, well, I suppose there are some sort of presuppositions that need to be sort of clarified, in relation to trying to answer a question like this. Obviously, since at least the 16th, 17th centuries in Europe, sovereignty has been thought of very much in a very strongly territorial sense. So the words sovereignty and territory, particularly in English, are very closely bonded together, whereas actually in some other European languages, there's less of an association. So in Italian or in French, territory can just refer to a place. It doesn't necessarily have this implication of being tied to state sovereignty. And so, in a way, I'm battling against this long-standing association, correlation between sovereignty and territory. So what's the basis then for thinking that sovereignty is something other than this? Well, I think I'd want to make a number of points. I've thought a little bit about this over the years. And the first one of these is that there really is no such thing as an isolated state. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the thinking about sovereignty is that that's what we do. We think very much in terms of, say, France or Britain or Germany or the United States or whatever. And then that actually traps our thinking about sovereignty because we associate it with a kind of an isolated state. And therefore the notion that somehow it exists separate from all others. But in fact, polities, including modern states, have always been part of much larger kind of universe of other states, other polities and so on, empires of one kind or another. And so they coexist by definition. They share larger spaces and recognize one another. And in fact, you could make the argument, as many people do in international relations theory, that states kind of exist partly because other states recognize them. that others say, oh, you're a real state, as opposed to having some kind of non-recognized existence means that you don't actually exist as a separate state.
I suppose
that would be the first point.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I suppose that's a problem with people such as the Palestinians, where, if they're not recognized as a state, then they exist in some kind of limbo.
That's right. Or so-called quasi-states, like Abkhazia, on the coast of the Black Sea, which was part of Georgia during when it was part of the Soviet Union, and now exists in a kind of limbo. Between Russia on the one hand and Georgia on the other, and isn't recognized very widely. I think maybe two or three states recognize Abkhazia. I think one of them is Venezuela, which kind of gives you a sense of.
So that's a very precarious position to be in, isn't it?
Exactly. Or Taiwan is maybe even a better example because it's had a long existence really as a quite well organized state. It has a real presence in the world economically and so on, but for example, it has trouble now getting diplomatic representation around the world because China next door, of course, regards Taiwan as part of its territory. So Taiwan's independence or its sovereignty is quite seriously constrained. So that will be an example of the first point. My second point would be that, though, at the same time, sovereignty, which is about for me, it's not just about authority, the right to rule on the part of a certain governmental apparatus over a given space or territory, but it's also about control. It's about, in a sense, being able to exercise some kind of power over that space relatively successfully. And so I think that it's very important that power within any space is never, ever completely concentrated. Local governments have some degree of relative autonomy. There are all kinds of civil society actors. And so sometimes we actually exaggerate the degree to which, in fact, states have this kind of centralized control over a given territory. So that will be the second point that I'd want to make. So even so-called successful states, ones that are recognized as such by other states and exercise some degree of control or authority within a given territory over their borders, controlling who comes in and who goes out, or what comes in and what goes out. Even they are faced always with a kind of a dispersion of power to other actors, not within their territories, and of course, in terms of the transactions that take place across their borders. So that would be a second point that I'd want to make in relation to ways in which sovereignty is not just contained completely or exercised absolutely within territorial units. Mm-hmm. Maybe a third point is that states of all sizes and weights exist across the world. I mean, we have, countries with incredibly large land area, think of Russia or Canada or the United States or Brazil or Indonesia. And then on the other hand, we have like tiny states, like Luxembourg or ones embedded completely within other states like the Vatican City or San Marino, in Italy. Obviously, we can think of these things as just anomalies, but I think the anomalies draw attention to the fact that not all states are equal entities. One of the fictions we have, I think it is a fiction, is that all states are somehow equal. So if you look at the United Nations building in New York, it has all the flags flying out in front of it. And in the General Assembly, at least, the General Assembly, is in a sense an assembly of peers or of equals. Yeah. But very quickly we know that the main institution within the UN is the Security Council. And who's on that? Well, there's a cycling in and out of some countries, but you have the four countries seated there that have been there for since the organization was founded after World War II. And so there's a real hierarchy of states. So that's what I'm trying to get at here. You have the great powers, you have these big countries, and then you have others that, in a sense are much smaller and obviously are going to be less powerful. So bigger countries then not only exercise power within their own territories, but exercise it beyond those borders. Think of the power that the United States has through its control over the world's most important reserve currency, the US dollar. I mean, it's a US currency, but so much of world trade beyond the borders of the United States is conducted in US dollars. So decisions that are made by US institutions have this shadow effect over the rest of the world that, for example, if your currency isn't very widely traded, the country like that wouldn't have. So the Swedish krona, for example, doesn't have the same kind of global reach that the US dollar does. So the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, has a kind of global kind of reach, which in a sense undermines the relative sovereignty of the currencies that are relatively more territorialized. That would be the example.
Right. Right.
And then maybe a final point I want to make is that the sovereignty territory nexus really only emerged in this as an ideal, really, in the 17th century. It still is a very powerful ideal. None of my debate about this wants to suggest that somehow we're living in a totally deterritorialized world, where sovereignty is completely now beyond the scope of particular states or the governments of those states. But before then, and increasingly in recent years, we see multiple kinds of jurisdictions evolving. So, for example, in medieval Europe, the church had this powerful kind of reach over the entire, much of what today is Western Europe. And around the time of the treaties of Westphalia and so on, did you get the emergence of the modern states. And that's always been a process in becoming. It's never of achievement. So states have always been sharing authority across various kinds of agents, often located well beyond the borders of their particular states. So right from the outset then, this has been an ideal, the idea of a territorial sovereignty, rather than that something that instantaneously was realized and then suddenly just maybe in the last 50 years because of something like globalization has somehow been undermined. States have always shared a high degree of sovereignty with other actors, churches, businesses, other states, in alliances, for example. So an alliance constrains your sovereignty in various ways. So all of these kinds of factors lead me to think that we can't think of sovereignty as being completely contained within discrete national units.
Right. Nevertheless, this idea is so deeply ingrained, isn't it? And I mean, it seems that you have to be a nation state within well-defined borders, as we were saying, with these states that are in some kind of limbo or proto-states, or people without a state. It's the story of many minorities, isn't it, that they sort of aspire to statehood, because without that, they seem destined to be disadvantaged in some way. How has it come about that the idea of the nation state has become so dominant, and the apparently natural form of geopolitical organization?
Yeah, well, of course, this is very much a historical process, and as I've been saying, it started really in Europe. So this was a European model of political organization to start with. And partly it was about declaring independence from the church. So we know there's a very strong, connection with the Protestant Reformation and the religious wars in Germany and in other parts of Europe. So, the famous phrase, cuius regio eius religio, the idea of whoever controlled a certain region or territory would then define the religion of the particular territory. So this was reinforcing the importance of territorial borders in many ways. So one of the roots of this ideal then goes back to Europe. But then what's interesting, and a number of people have made this point, European colonialism also had an important role to play in this, because when you were off, the Dutch, the British, the French, and so on, off building empires around the world, it was very important to demarcate which was your territory and which wasn't. So some of this goes back to the division of South America between Portugal and Spain, overseen ironically by the Pope. At the time, in the early 16th century. So the whole idea that territory would belong to one particular polity over against another is a very important part of the root of this whole system. And so the Europeans, in a sense, brought this back from their colonies also to Europe, the idea that you had to have a very well-defined set of borders, which was not the case with older polities, other systems of political organization. All the great empires often had very fuzzy boundaries. You know, the ancient Chinese Empire faded away at the edges. The Ottoman Empire likewise. I mean, it wasn't where one day you put one foot on one side of a wall and said, oh, now I'm in the Ottoman Empire and now I'm not. And sometimes we project backwards our own kinds of fetishes onto these. So we say, well, but they built walls, like
I was just going to say that you've got Hadrian's Wall and the Great Wall of China.
And so on. But these were military devices. They weren't really designed to control the flow of people or goods or to make territorial claims. In fact, the Romans would have liked to claim the whole of Scotland. But in fact, or what today we call Scotland. But in fact, Hadrian's Wall was built to keep out marauders coming down from the north. So these were military kinds of defensive works, rather than, in a sense, borders in the modern sense. So no one asked for your passport, when you were kind of coming across Hadrian's Wall. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, that the modern state has become closely attached to this territorial ideal, because of what were essentially religious reasons to start with, and then under the stimulus from colonialism. So Jordan Branch, who's an American political scientist, has argued at some length about the colonial origins of what he calls the kind of territorial obsession, the idea that you have to demarcate very clearly who owns what, which country controls which particular piece of land or sea, and so on. So I think that's very important. The second thing is, I think the whole idea of modernity, which developed in the 18th and 19th century, so very much an Enlightenment notion. We used to be like this, but now we're heading towards this. Ideas about progress and so on. Well, the territorial state, I think, got very much got attached to this idea. So if you're modern, you have to have a state. You have to have a territorial state. Otherwise, you're something else. You're like tribal, or you're some kind of nomadic enterprise. So again, I think, and partly this is ideological, it's a sort of a commitment to this as an ideal. If we're going to be modern, we have to have a state, and it has to be like these European ones. So it's a kind of an imitation process which is spread all around the world. So even as countries try to become independent of European empires in the 20th century, they were nationalist movements. They also then divided up the territory in a very European kind of way and said, well, this is where India begins and this is where Pakistan begins, and so on. After the partition of India in 1947, when in actual fact, of course, locally this was devastating to all kinds of traditional ties and connections and so on. So I think that's a very important part of this. And lurking behind this is our image of the past. So in Europe, we have this notion of a feudal Middle Ages, where you had local rule, but you had multiple jurisdictions. You had the church, you had various kinds of monarchs, you had local warlords of all kinds. You had knightly orders of one sort or another operating in the Baltic region and so on and so forth. And that's seen as like a chaotic past. And so what we get with a modern territorial state is a rational sort of division of space, so that power is kind of centralized. And increasingly, of course, it's associated as an expression of a particular nation or some kind of ethnos, of a group of people. And this is where we get the concept of the nation-state. Yeah. That part of the justification for having a state, which is, I think, what you were alluding to earlier, is because the nation maps onto the state neatly. And so some minorities who feel they're excluded from this process, they push, and this is where we get separatist nationalism and so on. So they want to have their own state. And so we get this process of territorial fission if you like, associated with claiming sovereignty over different spaces. And then another point I really want to make is that there's a kind of teleology that lurks behind this as well. I don't know about you, but when I was in school in Britain in the 1960s, really, there was this sense that, you know, these various nations were all waiting to get their state. That I remember one teacher I had even presented the Phoenicians, who I always thought of as people having this very networked connections around the Mediterranean. But the Phoenicians were a kind of proto-nation who at some time in the future would achieve nation statehood. This was a very Victorian or 19th century view of that, you know, if you go back far enough, you'll find the inklings of, you know, Germanic statehood or English statehood in all kinds of unlikely places. And then we kind of rewrite history to make it seem like, well, it was inevitable that, you know, we would go from these more primitive political organization to the modern state. And so with a writer like Hegel, you know, you get to the stage where the state is seen as the highest form of political organization. And so I think these are the reasons why we've tended to and it's not just ideological. After a while, of course, there are all kinds of material processes that kick in, particularly the growth of a kind of infrastructural power associated with states. So that railway systems would be a very good example. So, you know, cities like London or Paris or Madrid became the centers for these networks. And this reinforced the sense of belonging to a certain kind of territorial entity. So, you know, to travel from the north of England to the west of England, often it was easier to go through London rather than kind of directly. So you would, you know, go to Euston and then, you know, go across to Paddington and so on to do that. And I think the provision of public goods of one kind or another, not just with railways, however they were financed, but all kinds of public goods and mass elementary education, for example, again, an innovation of the 19th century. All of these things tended to produce an emphasis on turning, as Jürgen Weber said in a brilliant book, peasants into Frenchmen. You know, so people who never had this kind of political identity historically had a very strong consciousness now of their identity with this particular territory or this particular space. And there were practical reasons for this, because this was how railways worked, this was how schooling worked. Increasingly, there were vernacular languages, as opposed to, you know, dialects of mutually unintelligible dialects of one sort or another that used to prevail over, you know, many parts of Europe. Think of, you know, before the 1860s, you know, most Italians didn't speak Italian as we know it today. Italian today is very much based on Florentine dialect, really. So I think these are the kinds of forces that over time have produced this sense of an inevitability about a world divided up into unique and equivalent at the same time units of sovereign space, which we call territorial sovereignty.
It's a very compelling idea, though, isn't it? And it's striking the way that it, you know, reasserts itself. I mean, you know, one example would be after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, where really you had this ideology, internationalist ideology, to do with, you know, socialist organization and, you know, class differences being more important than ethnic differences. And for a long time, you know, the Soviet Union was this huge, quite well integrated empire, and the satellite states as well. And as soon as, you know, the sort of central control started to dissipate, you got these nationalisms, you know, as if they'd just been waiting for that moment, asserting themselves, in some cases, you know, resulting in horrendous wars like in the former Yugoslavia, in others just, you know, just just sort of appearing like in some of the Central Asian states as this kind of oven ready state, and more recently, I suppose, with the various populist leaders that have appeared, and Brexit as well. I mean, it remains a compelling idea, and an idea that despite globalization, despite various sort of supranational organizations like the EU, it's not going away, is it?
No. No, absolutely not. I mean, and part of the problem is we think of all these things in either or terms. So it's either, we have, America first, or Britain alone, or, whatever kind of phrase, or versus something like globalization. Well, in actual fact, the history's always been a lot more complicated than that. But it's very difficult to turn these complexities into any kind of sound bites, which are the kind of thing that, the stock in trade of politicians. And so, in relation to Brexit, for example, and we can maybe talk about this a little more in a minute, as soon as the referendum was over, a small majority, but a majority had voted in favor of leaving the European Union, immediately they were looking around for other entities to share sovereignty with, the Anglosphere, the Commonwealth, global Britain, which would rely on, international organizations like the World Trade Organization rules and so on and so forth. So, so the idea that you were ever going to be just completely alone was obviously a fallacy. But it was a very powerful one, though, as you're suggesting, because it's this notion that we're not just different, we're special, and we want to do just things in our own way. But apropos of what you were saying before about the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union, remember both of those countries were organized around ethnic divisions. So, for example, the former Yugoslavia, the main republics of Yugoslavia, were, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia. Only in Bosnia, which turned out to be the place where the disintegration was most violent, only there did you have a mixture of the various groups. So in many ways, these differences had been perpetuated through the old system as well. And Stalin in the former Soviet Union had also drawn the borders or the boundaries of the republics like Ukraine, Belarus, the Central Asian republics and so on, largely on an ethnic basis. I mean, you could have done it in a very different way, but that was the choice that was made. And so it helped to underpin so when it collapsed, it wasn't just, something that was, had been festering underneath or whatever. It was in fact based around the units that had been there all along. So for example, Stalin had insisted that Ukraine, when the Soviet Union joined the United Nations, that Ukraine have its own seat in the General Assembly. So, which is an example of this kind of fact that the ethnic divisions or national divisions were in fact a very important part of the old Soviet Union, not just of what's happened since.
Yeah, but I suppose the difference was that, even though those Soviet republics had, they still had some kind of location and borders and sort of some of the trappings of nationhood, they had no sovereignty. What a lot of them claimed back was exactly that. Some kind of sense of sovereignty, within their borders.
Well, they did, but then, the first thing that many of them did afterwards was either try to join this organization of states that Russia essentially sponsored, or join the European Union, which became, of course, the great tension between, say, Germany and Russia. Well, we're talking about why national sovereignty continues to be such a powerful idea. I think that maybe is the topic of the moment.
Yeah.
And I think there are a number of reasons why it's sort of revived. You were mentioning populist leaders and so on. I think one is that it is a backlash against the sense of being out of control that has come with globalization. Particularly over the last 50 years or so, the sense that, you know, businesses close down, move offshore, jobs go to China or somewhere, go to Southeast Asia, and that somehow this is a disruption of a kind of older natural order,
yeah,
you know, where economies were contained, you know, neatly within territorial boundaries. And so I think there's people think very powerfully this way. So rather than, for example, pointing out that automation is more responsible for the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States than anything else, people turn and say, oh, it's China that's to blame, you know? As if, you know, they were the ones who like stolen the jobs, when in actual fact, what happened was that many big American companies moved labor-intensive activities to countries like China, because of course they could pay people a whole lot less.
Yeah.
So there's but again, that's the root of it. I mean, we can identify it, but for people, of course, who are on the losing end of this becomes something to want to contain, to push back against, and looking back on a kind of golden age in the post-war years, you know, the 1950s and 1960s, as with a kind of nostalgia. When you were less subject to these outside influences, this sort of external world that now impinges so much on all of this. So I think that's partly it. Partly it's also I think, and this would be a second factor, this huge explosion of immigration around the world in the early 2000s, you know, from maybe the late 1990s through until 3 or 4 years ago. And the movement of people who are often culturally very different from the people who used to arrive, even though in the past immigrants were often treated badly, say in the United States anyway, Irish immigrants in the 19th century, or Jewish immigrants in the late 19th century. Today, of course, many of the immigrants are different racially and culturally. So you have a large increase in the immigration of Muslims, you know, who are seen as somehow very different and dangerous or threatening or whatever. So immigration has also, I think, been one of the sources of this sense of wanting to kind of reimpose border controls, to limit movement, to try and retain a degree of historic cultural homogeneity. We see all of the troubles in France at the moment relating to, you know, various, you know, awful incidents, terrorist incidents, really. But all of these are bound up with the idea of trying to reimpose some kind of territorial control over your national space to retain a high degree of cultural homogeneity. So, for example, we'll all agree on what is a joke, you know, that for example, that it's okay to, you know, have cartoons of religious figures and what have you. So these are very real forces producing a kind of a reinstatement of territorialized sovereignty. And there are a few other things I wanted to mention too. I think there's a golden age notion that's particularly powerful in Western Europe and in the United States. That somehow we used to be so much more territorialized and became less so. And what we want to do is to go back to that. So this is like make America great again. You know, it's not, it's very much a back to the future kind of logic. And of course, whether we can do that is I think, a very open question. I think big business, for example, is not going to want to go back to a world of very narrowly constrained borders. You know, in many ways, big business in the United States was a major agent of globalization because they had a profit crisis in the late 60s and early 1970s. I mean, if they're going to be constrained only to locate within the borders of the United States, that's going to limit their possibilities, and in the long run, it's also going to undermine the economic development of the entire country. So there are these real dilemmas, I think, that many people who are proponents of reinstating territorial sovereignty, they don't see the downside of some of these things.
But isn't it natural for people to want the idea that they have a direct influence on their government, and their government controls their environment? So you critique the sort of conflation of national self-determination, democracy, and sovereignty. And some of what you've been saying, obviously, addresses that as well. But I think in terms of people, particularly people maybe that feel that things are getting away from them, that they're not the winners of globalization, for instance, isn't it natural for them to feel that they want to know that their government controls what happens to them, and that they can vote for that government? And isn't it natural for them to feel that in UK terms, that London is more relevant to them and should be in control, rather than Brussels, which seems distant and seems like somebody else imposing things on them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. I think that's the common sense kind of view. I mean, absolutely. But you could make an argument that actually for large numbers of people in England, Brussels has been actually a better seat of government than London has, because London is, particularly the British government, has favored the economic sectors that are dominant within the city of London, within the metropolis, rather than the entire economy of England or of the United Kingdom on a larger scale. And so, I mean, there's an irony here. I mean, because in many ways, since the 1980s, British governments have been, I think I could make this argument very strongly, have been behind the deindustrialization of Britain much more than the EU bureaucracy in Brussels, and favored with national economic policies all of the financial sector. I mean, and so the financial sector has been favored very much at the expense of, say, preserving traditional manufacturing industry. So if you look at the north of England, or you look at the English Midlands, and the hollowing out of industry and so on, in fact, Brussels has tried to encourage, for example, regional policies, cohesion policies, and so on. But British governments have been, resolutely just pursuing this kind of finance sector oriented national economic policy, which favors London and the southeast of England at the expense of everybody else. So I mean, I think you can make that argument. I think it's a very, very strong one. So Brussels is actually better for you than London.
Well, that's certainly what Scottish voters seem to think anyway, and it's quite interesting to see how the constellation of the different nations of the UK have voted and have reacted. And of course, Northern Ireland, which, as you say in your paper, hardly came up in the campaign running up to the referendum, has turned out to be a very, very thorny issue, particularly because of questions of sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. So in that case, since 1998, at least, you can argue that in Northern Ireland, it's been a kind of shared sovereignty. I mean, effectively between Dublin and London.
Yeah.
And with a degree of local involvement as well in Belfast. But this is the world. This is the complex world of sovereignty. It's never just neatly boxed territories. In another paper, I point out that I grew up I was born and grew up in a house where you could look out of the house, and on a day when it wasn't raining, you could see the Isle of Man. and of course, the joke there was that if you could see it, it was going to rain. That was the local idiom. And of course, the Isle of Man is this weird anomaly. I mean, it doesn't send representatives to the British Parliament. It's a crown dependency. It has its own parliament, but right. it has no income tax. It's a tax haven stuck in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland, and there are loads of these kinds of anomalies around the world. But, you know, it relies on the Bank of England in terms of its, it uses the pound sterling. It relies on Britain for defense and foreign affairs. So this is another example. This is a good example of shared sovereignty. I mean, in a weird way, it's not even clear that the Isle of Man belongs to the European Union. I mean, you know, it's got a very ambiguous, like the Channel Islands as well, this kind of ambiguous sovereignty. And there are lots of places like this around the world.
Well, I suppose a place like that, which is a tax haven, can, you know, benefit from the fact that there's plenty of money sloshing around and they're not really worth invading to, you know, get by, you know, fine. But isn't it inevitable that other states, you know, that they're going to struggle for the maximum amount of sovereignty or power over their own territory and to try and project it beyond? Because if you don't fill that, you know, that power space, then somebody else will.
Yeah, but frequently you can't do it on your own. And so this is where it's a question of shared sovereignty. So, I mean, the whole idea of what I call integrated sovereignty, which is like how the United States was created or how the EU is being created, and arguably how the United Kingdom, it wasn't so much created this way, but it's become like this, where you have a sharing of sovereignty. You know, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, they have separate parliaments and governments. They even have, you know, limited taxing powers, these other governments.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these things have emerged because of the need to share sovereignty in order to serve other purposes. So, you know, I think Britain joined the European Union in the early 1970s because it was seen as going to be advantageous to the British economy. I think that was, and it was a very economistic argument. There were very few, I can't remember many people back in those days arguing in favor of joining because they wanted to have a federal Europe or they thought of themselves as Europeans. They didn't at all. But they saw it as having economic advantages over the long term. And what sort of surprised me with the whole Brexit thing is how, well, what's the evidence that that still isn't the case? I mean, and there is no evidence that that still isn't the case. You know? But it's this nostalgia for some other period, like when Britain was the seat of an empire, or even back in the 50s. But you know, I can't remember the 50s and 60s being such a golden age in Britain. That dates me, I think.
Well, yeah, particularly the 70s, you know, were very chaotic, weren't they? And that's one of the eras that people seem to hark back to. It seems strange that, I mean, just thinking back to what you were saying earlier about this sort of fictive equivalence in these international organizations of states of very disparate sizes and you know, amounts of power. I mean, that's certainly the case within the European Union, isn't it? Each country has a veto on, you know, many questions, and that ranges from Luxembourg to Germany, you know, which are, you know, very, very different in terms of size and economic, you know, power, certainly. But Britain, without question, was one of the big boys, and very influential. I mean, you know, the expansion to Eastern Europe, the single market, these are basically British ideas that were, you know, promoted by Britain. And yet, you know, at least half the population clearly didn't recognize that power and that influence and didn't value it at all. How is that possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a number of different, you know, answers to that. One was that I think particularly during the Brexit referendum, the anti-Brexit arguments were not very well articulated. I think a lot of people, you know, and there are a lot of reasons for why this would be the case. You know, the tabloid press, all kinds of things. Yeah, people tended to blame Brussels, you know, for all kinds of, you know, impositions. But in fact, many of these were not things that had dire effects on Britain at all. Many of them were exaggerated. And in fact, what it did was it detracted attention from the fact that British governments were responsible for a lot of the negative things that happened to the British economy in particular, I think, in the 1980s and 1990s.
I wonder who they'll blame now.
Well, this is then a problem, isn't it?
What would be an alternative vision of international organization where is it inevitable that you know, these supranational organizations are mistrusted? I mean, even, you know, in the United States, a lot of people seem to hate the federal government, and yet it's obviously necessary in many ways. What would be a way of I don't know, seeing the world that's more cognizant of the complexities of the various interactions and flows that exist?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of points that can be made about this. I think this is an important argument. You know, one is that we tend to think of governance in very sort of, again, in very zero-sum or either-or terms. So, so we think that, you know, we have a big state, a very centralized one, or we have incredibly decentralized ones with a clear division of functions across that. So you know, multi-tier governance, you know, for me is really the future of the world rather than complete centralization. But what that needs, in my view, isn't this kind of very rigid division, a kind of dualist vision where these units do this and those units do, and the larger unit does something else, but where there's what we can call polyphony, you know, which is in effect a negotiation and a high degree of cooperation across these levels. I think we see this in terms of the US, the utter failure of the US to manage the pandemic that we're living through at the moment, where the federal government has essentially told the states that they're on their own.
Right.
And has in fact done very, very little, in my view, to help the states. And has in a sense encouraged the states to be competitive with one another. So they were all out bargaining, you know, kind of with private firms over who would get personal protective equipment and so on, or how to conduct testing and so on. And partly this is a result of this kind of anti-federalism, which, as you noted, has become very strong in the United States. This sort of fear of the federal government, or a sense that the federal government ought to be cut down to size or ought to be hollowed out. And of course, with the Trump administration, we've also had a very amateurish kind of group of people running anything. So many of the political appointees have no qualifications at all for the tasks that they're given. They have no expertise in the areas that they're supposed to be operating in. And the primary qualification is loyalty to the president. And so what's happened is that the federal system has kind of broken down. Whereas in Australia, I think I certainly don't want to use Australia as you know, like the ultimate example of how governance should be conducted. But in Australia, the way in which the pandemic has been managed has been incredibly positive, because the different tiers of government have collaborated with one another. So you have the federal government in Canberra, and then you have the various states. The states ultimately have had responsibility for, you know, making decisions about lockdowns and so on and so forth. But the federal government has created a kind of national plan that then the states have all followed, because they've all been consulted. Right. And the government of Australia, which is quite right-wing and in some ways quite populist, refused to politicize it. Right. Whereas, you know, in the United States, we've done the exact opposite of this. So I think multi-tier governance is the way to go. Many things can be done better locally. I'm convinced of that. I think one of the things that amazes me about Britain, particularly England, is it's as centralized as North Korea. You know, I mean, the local government has largely disappeared. One of the positive signs in recent years in Britain has been the election of mayors, you know, in some of the larger cities like Manchester and so on. And so you can have power spread across these different units. So sovereignty, again, is being shared rather than just pooling up in West London. And for many things, that's how you need to go. But you do need a government in the center that, you know, that has some degree of encourages cooperation and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we certainly had issues here in England with, you know, government formulating policy and then trying to roll it out, and then the mayors that you mentioned pushing back, saying, oh, we haven't been consulted properly on this and this isn't right for us, or we haven't got the right funding. So, you know, there have certainly been tensions between, you know, central power and local administrations, whereas the you know, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, you know, have got control over this and, you know, have had different rules in place. But yeah, it's communication between those different levels that sort of has to be there for things to run smoothly, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so I suppose my view then is that we need to have more multi-tier governance from the international level all the way down to the local level.
Mm.
So it's more sensitive to local differences. I suppose what I'm trying to argue against is this notion of always privileging this nation-state as the primary unit or the only unit of governance. Mm. That doesn't mean you can somehow get rid of it. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. No. But that in a sense, as an ideal, it's kind of run its course. And what we need is to think much more in terms of multi-tiered governance, matching the purposes that governments are supposed to address. So our problem is we've had a kind of one size fits all kind of model of governance, which is the nation-state. In Hannah Arendt's term, this is the tragedy of the nation state. It's that it's become an ideal that no longer fits the needs of the modern world.
I suppose you're not a politician, and I'm sure you don't want to give a hostage to fortune, but we are just a month and a bit away from the end of the transition period when the UK will leave. There still hasn't been a trade deal. The kind of focus has been taken away from it because of the pandemic. But what what do you think might happen? And you give these interesting, you know, different possibilities. You know, repatriating sovereignty, integration into the Anglosphere, you know, other international organizations, or things like the Belt and Road Initiative, or Global Britain, Singapore on Thames. What do you think is the most likely outcome, or the most likely destination? Yeah.
Well, I think there's no way that in the end the UK can avoid having some kind of fairly formal relationship with the European Union. I think, you know, people throw around these numbers, but at least 40%, I think, of UK trade is with European partners. And of course, many British businesses are quite integrated into the wider European economy. And so that's got to be at least, you know, something. So I'm not sure that's going to be negotiated by the end of the year, but in the end, I don't think it can be avoided. So the notion of sort of like floating off into the North Atlantic, I think is very much a fiction. But I think there are other options. I mean, and they talked about these a little bit a year or 2 years ago. You know, one is the kind of Canadian deal, you know, where you could strike some kind of arrangement with the European Union like that Canada has negotiated. I think for trade in goods, trade in manufactured goods, that might actually work. I think, though, it's going to have to be refined somewhat, partly because of the border question in Ireland, and also because of the fact that, in fact, services are much more important now to the British economy than goods are, and particularly trying to preserve the role of London.
Okay, well, I think we can draw it to a close there. Thank you very much, Professor Agnew. It's been really interesting talking to you about this, and we shall see what the new year brings.
Take care. Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye.